Without further ado, let's get into it. I am so pleased to introduce our presenter today, Marty Lewis. Since joining Synergex in 2007, Marty has worn a variety of hats as a software engineer or manager for the Workbench and Synergy DBL integration for Visual Studio products. He was instrumental in the delivery of traditional Synergy support for the SDI product and was more recently the architect for the new unit testing support for traditional Synergy. He now serves the company as software development manager and works across teams to improve processes and innovate. Take it away, Marty.
Welcome to the Visual Studio Integration Product Update. My name is Marty Lewis, and I'm a software development manager here at Synergex, and the Visual Studio Integration product is right in my wheelhouse. So, what exactly are we going to see in this presentation? Visual Studio is a big place, and our product sits on top of it. Visual Studio 2019 has already had 10 updates at this time of writing, and there are features and functionality that are useful to you and your developers. The first place we should start is what's new in VS that I should care about. Next, we will talk about some of the newer enhancements that have been added to the SDI product itself to help make you more productive, and probably cover some of the older features that you should already be using. And finally, we can talk about what's ahead for the product. That's a lot to cover, so let's jump right in. What's new in Visual Studio 2019? In case you aren't familiar with how Microsoft's Visual Studio product updates, they have switched to a far more dynamic release cycle since the start of Visual Studio 2017. In Visual Studio 2019, we've been seeing 4 to 5 feature releases per year, numbered 16.0 to 16.10, with smaller bug fix patches coming out sometimes multiple times a week as necessary. This definitely keeps your developer tools fresh and able to deal with all of the new technologies that you and your team need in order to stay competitive. With any feature release, however, there is potential for some bugs when you adopt a new VS version. Infrequently, these feature releases may even introduce breaking changes to Synergy support that require an SDI update. Our team tests against both the current shipping feature release as well as the public preview of upcoming versions, so it should be rare that we do not already have an updated SDI product ready to go. I would highly recommend that you keep your Visual Studio up to date if at all possible, and when you get that Visual Studio update, make sure you head over to the Synergy Resource Center download site to pick up the newest SDI release as well. So right out the gate, .NET Framework 4.8 support was added in version 16.3 back in September of 2019. That's already more than a year and a half ago. This version of .NET Framework is the last version of .NET Framework, but it's intended to have continued support. You should probably be on 4.7.2 by now with your .NET Framework applications and be looking to 4.8 soon. This version lives alongside the .NET Core 3.1 and .NET 5 support inside of Visual Studio, which have their own flavors of projects. The next change on the list is one of my favorite additions in the VS 2019 lifespan: user experience improvements for Git. The previous integration in VS was through the Team Explorer dialog, which works well enough if you're used to operating through the Microsoft Team Foundation server on-prem system, but it was starting to lack if you're used to using Git in VS Code or other tools. This new workflow is centered around your Git source control rather than the TFS project. It is much easier to view changes, stashes, handle your sync operations, and switch branches all in one piece of UI instead of hitting a bunch of drop-downs and switching tabs all the time. If you're a Git user, give it a try. You can find it under the View menu as Git Changes. Of note, if Git Changes still shows the old interface for you, you may need to toggle it on under the Tools, Options, Environment, Preview Features, New Git User Experience. It is supposed to be the default by now, but I've seen users get varying results. This next user experience change from version 16.4 will depend on your tastes, but I know from past Workbench users that there are some of you who will love this one. Vertical file tabs. If you are tired of the stacking mess of tabs at the top of your screen with various states of popping in and out of view based on how recently you hit it, you can now right-click, set tab layout to left or right, and get your file tabs stacked vertically. Combined with a few grouping options, you might find it a lot easier to keep track of your open files in the editor using this feature. In particular, I have found that grouping by project to be an excellent parallel to the way I think about source files distributed in my projects, and it's much easier to follow. And of course, you can still pin tabs in the vertical view to give your current working files that extra bit of precedence while you're knee-deep in solving a problem. Next up is the Test Explorer. I did not realize just how much this dialog needed improvement until those improvements started showing up in the editor. We recently did some work in Visual Studio 2017 around unit testing, and the difference between it and VS 2019 are night and day different. Since version 16.2, the UI responsiveness has improved noticeably, making it much easier to interact with the Test Explorer while operating in large codebases, like many of yours, and even while it is mid-test discovery or test execution. In the same release, Visual Studio added a nice quality of life around column customization, ordering, and test filtering. The best description I have is that it's all way less clunky than it felt in VS 2017. Not only can you customize which columns are visible and sort by them, there is also filtering baked into the columns that is contextual. So for the duration column, you can filter by only tests with a fast runtime, or maybe you need to focus on the tests that are taking 15 or 30 seconds to run. Likewise, you can filter the view by traits, framework types, project, run state. Anything else that feels relevant is pretty much available. Generally, this set of changes makes managing large numbers of tests and actually working with them far less cumbersome. Since version 16.7, there has also been additional shortcut keys for running tests and managing the view, as well as dynamic test playlists to give you even more ways to manage which tests are being run. In short, the playlist updates make it much easier to control subsets of your tests, toggle tests on and off with a checkbox, and really fine-tune which tests are running at any particular time. I guess they also felt like this feature needed a fun ribbon on top, because in version 16.9, they also introduced configurable audio cues. So if your unit tests take a while to run, but you're waiting on results, you can set yourself an alarm for success or failure while you keep working on other tasks and not worry about when your tests are going to finish. Another one of my favorite parts of Visual Studio also received some updates: the debugging experience. These changes are specific to .NET, as traditional Synergy uses a different debug engine, but I would be remiss not to share some of the new quality of life improvements going into the debugger. If you've ever been deep into debugging a multi-threaded application, then you will recognize why a tool like a window of parallel stacks might be useful. The debugger in Visual Studio tries to give you a hint of when your debug session moves threads, but it can take a great deal of concentration just to keep track of which thread is which. Thanks to the new Parallel Stacks window, that could become a little bit easier. This new tool window will do its best to diagram the current state of the process, grouping like stacks with like, and showing you relationships between the stacks and threads. Best of all, it does it in real time while you debug your way through the application. The tool window itself is dockable like anything else, so you can keep it side by side, dock it like a source file, or drag it out of the window completely. It is also pretty full-featured in its display, complete with zoom controls, auto zoom, filtering, method focus mode, search, and a save capability in case you really need to review that set of parallel stacks later. In terms of multi-threaded debugging, I think Microsoft has a really stellar beginning to this feature. Microsoft have also enhanced the instrumentation feature of the Performance Profiler. If you're not familiar with the profiling tools and are doing .NET development, I highly recommend you take a look. It can give you insight into performance bottlenecks in your application, help you find memory leaks, help you track hot paths, and many other features. Synergy.net projects are generally compatible with these tools. We have seen some of the options gray out incorrectly, though. If you have this problem, just target the output executable instead of your project, and they should light right back up. Enough about Visual Studio proper. It's finally time to talk about SDI instead. This first item is a Visual Studio staple that was sorely lacking from our language integration. But I'm pleased to share that it is in the product and actually working quite well. You asked for it, we asked for it, and we figured out a way to finally deliver red squiggles or error tags or inline error information or however you want to refer to it. We were a little concerned that the fidelity of error information from our compiler might make for a messy rollout on this feature, and there were definitely some hiccups and very marked up files along the way. So our initial versions were disabled by default. Thanks to the help of adventurous early adopters providing valuable feedback and helping us clean up the rougher edges, you can finally see your error and warning information inline in your source files. I will not go out and claim that this feature is perfect, but it is getting better with every release, and it's well worth having enabled. So what can it do? What are its limitations? First off, it works in both traditional Synergy and Synergy.net and produces really good results. It's driven by the same Synergy compiler on the backend that provides all of the IntelliSense data, and that means it understands your project, compiler option preferences, project references, and external library references as well. The goal is that the errors you see inline are the same errors that you would see if you went to build the source and project in their entirety. But with that same backend, there are a few limitations. That means your error data might be incomplete if the background compile process for your solution has not finished running. For some of your largest projects, that means there might be a noticeable delay between opening up your solution and error data being available, but we think the fidelity is an important enough trade-off. It's also limited by a few compiler options that we have to turn on internally in order to get your IntelliSense data in the right format. You will likely never see a conflict from this, but you may see some level 3 or 4 warnings from time to time that do not normally show up in your build. If you do, this might be the explanation for that. In addition to just seeing the squiggles, you can hover over the marked region to get a full error message that would have been output by the compiler. If you are like me and do not like to take your hands off the keyboard, that visual can be triggered by pressing the quick info hotkey. Control+K, then Control-I as a chord by default. If this is not enabled for you and you want to start using it, you can find the option called Underline Errors in Editor inside of our advanced options page under the Synergy language specific options. Of course, if it's ever getting in your way, you can turn it off from the same place. While we're on the topic of errors and warnings, we added a feature several versions back to make it much easier to track down the documentation for a given compiler warning or error. When you run into an error or warning in your code that you are unfamiliar with, there's no need to jot down the error code. Go open the manual and try to figure out where the errors section is. With all of our documentation online, you can just Google it, right? No, of course not. No. You're in an IDE, which is a fully integrated experience. Just click on the error in the error list and press F1 to open up our web documentation to the right place. The same functionality is also exposed by right-clicking on the error and selecting Show Error Help. I would not necessarily call pressing F1 in a particular UI context a discoverable feature anymore, so here I am telling you about it directly. It's a good tip outside of Synergy as well, as we're piggybacking on an actual help feature of Visual Studio to do this. So you should be able to find error help for other compilers and tools as well. You don't have to have an error for documentation shortcuts to be helpful either. Anyone new to Synergy might not be as familiar with the built-in language statements, routines, functions, etc. If you press F1 while your cursor is on most Synergy built-ins within a code editor window, we will also take you to the web documentation for that thing under the cursor. Once again, since I feel like F1 isn't all that discoverable, we also wired up this particular piece of functionality to go-to definition. So attempting a go-to def on one of the language built-ins will also take you to the appropriate web documentation, since you cannot see the source definition. If you have ideas about how we could improve this sort of integrated help, we would love to hear about it on the ideas site. This next item is certainly not a new feature. It is core to the product at this point, but it bears repeating. In order to facilitate your developers staying on the most current version of SDI, our compilers and tools support targeting older versions of the Synergy DE runtime. We call this feature runtime targeting. It's really straightforward. In any of your traditional Synergy or Synergy.net projects, you can find a target Synergy runtime option on the build property page. That option instructs the tooling to create binaries that are compatible with the runtime that you selected. This option is stored on a per configuration basis, so make sure you have it set appropriately for each target platform in both release and debug. You will not see every single Synergy DE release when looking in the target runtime dropdown box. Only releases that actually had a runtime feature requiring a compatibility target will end up in this list. For example, you will not see any versions between 11.1.1 and 11.1.1d, as there were not substantial runtime changes in A, B, or C that require a new compatibility target. This functionality also supports targeting back to versions that predated the initial runtime targeting support release. For traditional Synergy, you can go as far back as 9.5.1. For Synergy.net, we support back to 10.1.1. With runtime targeting driven by SDI and compiler tools, you only need to worry about having the correct runtime selected to produce consistent continuous integration builds, and testing your changes against different versions during the development can be as easy as changing one option. Meanwhile, using the latest compiler tools gives you the benefit of a number of performance and stability improvements made since your target runtime first came out. So if you're targeting 9.5.1, you get the benefit of all those compiler changes since then. All of the features that we are covering today are great quality of life features for Synergy developers, but this next topic is really something special. All languages in Visual Studio can have some degree of smart decision making when it comes to picking and choosing which projects can build. But we take it a step further with Synergy. In both traditional Synergy and Synergy.net, we are able to use deterministic symbol information about the compilation results of your project to make an informed decision about whether the change you recently made actually requires recompilation of projects that depend on it, rather than just checking timestamps of what changed most recently. All of that is just a fancy way of saying that we really understand your projects and their dependencies, and their dependencies, and their dependencies, and so on, as long as those dependencies are Synergy. The reason that this is important is that many of you, if not all of you, have large intertwined sets of project dependencies. In most examples that I have seen, almost all of your solutions will have a series of core library root dependencies that, when touched, will cause you to have to rebuild every last project in your solution. While we're always trying to help bring down those build times, wouldn't it also be nice if we skipped builds when it wasn't necessary? If you're working in a core library trying to fix a bug in possibly decades-old routines, the last thing that you want is to wait 5 or 10 minutes every time you go to test a change. There are many occasions where the changes that you make do not require all of the dependencies to build. Did you do some whitespace formatting? That doesn't need to rebuild everything. What about logic inside one of those core libraries? No, actually, that doesn't require a rebuild either, as long as you didn't change the shape of the routines, methods, classes, etc. that are available in that library. If you are refining the logic inside of a routine or two, that change is benign from a linkage perspective and should not require you burning time that could be better spent troubleshooting. Of course, if you make more substantial change, we will still need to rebuild. Changing the arguments list of the method or adding a whole nother routine or class will cause the rebuilds to go up the dependency tree. This idea for this feature actually came to us through the ideas site. One of the complaints that we used to hear is that this Visual Studio build system requires too many builds when you don't need them. Many customers were used to only building the libraries that needed to be rebuilt, using the same sort of decision-making process that we have automated into this system. Yes, we will still build all of the things that depend on the library instead of the few things you may be working on, but at least you will not have dependency tree changes throwing you off. Keeping with the theme of bringing down build times, we now also have support for Visual Studio's parallel build facilities. You have been able to do parallel builds from the MS build side for quite some time now using the /m switch, but you could not get the same benefit from synergy projects in Visual Studio until 11.11g. What this feature does is utilize the in-process understanding of your project dependencies to decide which libraries can build in parallel, and check to see whether or not there is capacity to start another build. Projects that can build in parallel, as far as the Visual Studio Solution Manager understands, may then build in parallel. So rather than building each of your projects serially, you could have 2 or 4 or 8 or maybe even 32 projects building simultaneously. You can control how many parallel builds you want to allow at a given time. If you head over to the options dialog, hit the projects and solutions category and look at the build and run page, there's a box at the top for specifying how many builds you want to allow to happen. This number will default to the count of CPU threads that Visual Studio detects on your system. The maximum value, according to Microsoft documentation, is 32 concurrent builds. I haven't tested that upper limit, so if you have a 64 or 128 core machine on hand, let me know how it goes. Of course, in order for this feature to work best, you will have to have a well-formed solution with lots of project references so that the dependencies can be understood correctly. Notably, if a lot of your core libraries have intertwined dependencies, you may not get a lot of parallel builds going on at once. But once you're into the higher level apps and tests and libraries, you may see substantially faster build times. If you have soft dependencies between projects that might build in parallel, you might have a bad time. If you do have something like that in your solution, but you don't want to reference the projects to each other for one reason or another, you can access a project dependencies dialog by right-clicking on the solution in your Solution Explorer. That dialog gives you a way to manage your dependencies without making a project reference. Finally, not every language in VS will support this feature. There are special implementation details. As long as your solution is primarily Synergy, C#, and C++, you should have a good experience. Closing out our build features is a feature for anyone that may still get fed up with too many builds that we call project only build. I would not necessarily recommend this feature for everyone, but when you have that one time where you only want 1 or 2 projects to get built, this tool puts you in full control. We expose this feature on any Synergy project, either in the context menu for the project in the Solution Explorer, or in the top-level build menu. You can also configure hotkeys for this functionality through the keyboard page inside of the environment category of the Visual Studio options dialog. Clicking Build Only Project will only build the one project that you selected. Similarly, A rebuild-only project will clean and build only the selected project. And finally, clean-only project will clean only the selected project. Going through your solution and clicking each project and building them one at a time sounds like a really tedious workflow. Generally, you're just going to want to click Build Solution and let the build system do its job. This next feature is one of my favorite new additions to the SDI product, where the idea originated from customers. Last conference, I had the opportunity to talk to the audience about unit tests and testing paradigms in one of my sessions. And during the Q&A of that session, someone asked about support for unit tests in traditional Synergy. Of course, you could write a collection of small programs to serve as unit tests and wire that up to build and run whenever you make changes, but that would not feel like a very unified development experience. So we set out to create a system for writing traditional Synergy unit tests that would feel at home next to the Synergy.net and C# versions, would run in Visual Studio, and be easy to run in a DevOps environment. Getting started with traditional Synergy unit tests is very straightforward. We ship a new unit test traditional template in Visual Studio that is pre-configured to reference our unit test framework. All you need to do is create a new unit test project, add references to your other Synergy libraries, and start authoring tests that call your code. This system is completely integrated into the Test Explorer window inside of Visual Studio. So after you build your unit test project, any correctly attributed tests will show up and be runnable from right inside the Test Explorer window. If you usually run MS-Test or in-unit inside of a DevOps pipeline or from the Visual Studio Test Console, you can also run these traditional Synergy tests. We provide a test adapter for the VS Test Console. As long as that adapter can be found, you should just be able to run VS Test Console against your unit test library ELB as though it were a .NET assembly. If you already have some familiarity with MS-Test, the tooling behind Synergy.net unit tests, then you already know enough to be proficient with our framework. We were aiming to have a very familiar working experience to Synergy.net, even though there is no .NET at play in this framework. If you're not familiar with MS-Test, it is relatively straightforward. In order to identify that a test is a test, we use an attribute syntax that can specify which classes contain test methods, which methods should serve as initialization, which methods should serve as tests, and which methods should serve as cleanup. You have some scoping capability, like indicating methods that should clean up for a whole class, or being run after each test case. Those attributes also provide a means of specifying metadata about your methods that's useful at compile time or runtime. We added owner and test category attributes to help you filter and organize your tests in your Test Explorer window, while on the other side, you can utilize the test property attribute to specify a collection of key value pairs that would be available to your tests through a helper class at runtime. This might be useful if you are writing helper methods to reduce boilerplate in your test cases, for example. Those test property attributes can also be seen in your Test Explorer. In order to actually declare the pass-fail nature of your tests, we provide an assert class with a variety of truthiness, nullness, and equality methods for establishing whether or not your test cases pass. When an assertion is true, nothing happens and the test continues. But when an assertion is false, it will throw an exception that is caught by the test executor and displayed in your Test Explorer. The methods in the assert class also support an optional message string to be displayed upon failure. Because we rely on exceptions here, wrapping your assert calls in a try-catch will prevent that information from reaching the test executor, so you would not see those results. On the flip side, if the code called by your test throws an uncaught exception, that exception will be caught by the test executor and reported to you, as long as there's no try-catch in the way. Of course, running traditional Synergy code requires running the traditional Synergy runtime. The test runner that manages execution is authored entirely in Synergy and utilizes the Synergy DE runtime. This gives you the confidence to know that your test cases can actually represent the same running condition as your primary applications. However, since there were minor features added to the runtime to support some of the abstraction necessary for unit tests, you will have to have at least the 11.11d version of Synergy DE on your development device to make use of this feature. Finally, the test support would not be complete without debug capabilities. All that you need to do to debug a unit test is place a breakpoint in your code, right-click the test in the Test Explorer, and click Debug. That will start a debug session just like any other traditional Synergy application. I know that's a lot of information at once. There is complete documentation of the unit test attributes and the assert class methods available on our web docs. You can also find a great video walking through writing traditional Synergy unit tests from scratch by Nick Tamage on the Synergex YouTube channel. Finally, there are real-world test cases written with this framework on the Synergex Harmony Core project on GitHub. Links to all of these things are available on the resources page accompanying the conference materials. So, with all that awesome stuff already in the product, what is next? Caveat before we start, these are forward-looking statements and are not guarantees. Our schedules are subject to change based on customer need and market conditions, you know. So top of the list for us are IntelliSense improvements, with some new features like red squiggles already out the door and a bevy of bug fixes and consistency improvements just released in the latest update. We're on a good pace for substantially improving the IntelliSense user experience this year. We're taking a step back and looking at each part of the IntelliSense system, figuring out the weaknesses, grouping in associated known bugs, and taking big steps forward with the reliability and consistency. I know that when I'm using the product to develop Synergy code, issues in this area are most likely to frustrate me. So hopefully these improvements give you a much better product experience in your day-to-day development. One area that we want to target is generally our understanding of routine overloads. We previously had some bugs around navigating on the correct method overload during GoToDefinition that have highlighted some problem areas for us. For example, we could do a better job of offering the correct method overload in signature IntelliSense, either when you ask for it or as you add additional arguments that narrow down the list. Parameter IntelliSense has also been in a bit of a rough state, with the system not really being very smart about where your methods begin and end, or not great at moving between parameters in the argument list, or some issues with nested method calls, and even some differences in behavior when you're calling an X call or a percent function. Fortunately, we have already put out a number of fixes related to this area, and the remaining work is mostly rooting out edge cases around generics. We're also looking at further improvements of the performance of our background IntelliSense operations. This would mean faster processing of errors that produce red squigglies, and faster processing of symbols so your completion IntelliSense and other systems reflect your most recent changes when you want them. At the core, the Synergy compiler is actually doing all the parsing and analysis of your code to provide that data that we use to offer IntelliSense. We're looking at ways to shave time off the infrastructure that surrounds the compiler, as well as working with the compiler team to find performance bottlenecks around the processing of single source files. We have some examples of customer code where the source files are around 50,000 lines of code and causing exceptional slowdowns. But we would like more. If you have examples that cause you frustration, our team would like to hear from you for your specifics. Finally, we are looking to improve the support for Lambda statements for Synergy.net. especially those in line with method calls. While the compiler does a pretty good job with the syntax, SDI is lagging behind a bit. We don't do a great job of isolating that scope between the curly braces, nor do we really have a good understanding of the arguments being provided to the Lambda method. We want to make this experience much better than it is today. Of course, we're not just looking to improve IntelliSense. There is plenty of work to do across the SDI product in the coming months that is really exciting. Build performance is an area that has received a lot of focus recently in order to drive down build times, reduce memory overhead, and ensure that our build support works with the latest Microsoft tools in the MS Build ecosystem. Some of those changes have boasted pretty crazy build time improvements for traditional Synergy projects, but we're not done yet. We still have some ideas on how to minimize excess compile and link operations inside of our build system, and some interesting theories around utilizing object libraries to reduce ELB library build times. Also, any improvements that are made to the compiler tools for IntelliSense builds are likely to have some impact on what you see during normal build operations. Thanks to votes and engagements on the Ideas site, we will also be adding support for compiling Windows scripts in VS. We are still working out specifics for how best to integrate the script compiler workflow, so I don't have more details for you today, but this is a feature that I'm anticipating we will be able to ship later this year. If you have a specific use case for your compiled Windows script ISAM files, we would love to hear feedback about how you use it so we can make the feature as useful as possible. We are also looking at adding improved support for the Synergy data language that is used in repository schema files. Since the addition of the repository project type, we have been steering toward a code-centric approach to repository. I think it's past time that we give you some colorization, completion, and go-to definition support. The good news is that parts of this have already been implemented and are looking great, but the support is still really early days, and we only want to ship it when it's a good experience. If there is interest, we may consider gating this behind a feature flag so you can use early versions. If that sounds like you or someone you know, please reach out to us and let us know. Naturally, SDI will also need to undergo changes to support .NET 5 and .NET 6 alongside the compiler and runtime tools. There are some notable challenges to getting WinForms and WPF designers working correctly in that .NET 5 and 6 world. We're looking to have this done alongside Microsoft's .NET 6 ship date later this year. Finally, there is another thing on the SDI roadmap, and it is Visual Studio 2022 support. Microsoft has recently announced the newest major version of Visual Studio will be called 2022. And of course, SDI is planning to support that new version alongside the yet to be announced Microsoft general availability date. We do have some details about what is going into that new version of the product, and our team is already doing preparatory work using the release preview SDK to ensure we're not caught off guard by the new release date. So details. What details do we have? We have details. First and foremost, we know that the new version will finally be the first version of Visual Studio to be 64-bit. And that is a change that has been sorely needed for years. Think about that. All of your developer tools have been crammed into a 32-bit address space this whole time. Or cleverly moved out of process to avoid the limitation. One of the biggest challenges that we have had with large customer solutions are the memory limitations on our in-process tooling. So the SDI product team is ecstatic to see this change in the wild. However, supporting a new bitness in editor means rather substantial changes from the API side for interfaces that we utilize and potentially some edge cases that will need to be ironed out. From what we have seen so far, however, the change has been mostly for the better. Visual Studio product has a lot of history and a lot of backward compatibility driven requirements. So this sort of major milestone is an opportunity for Microsoft to clean up some of the cruftier APIs in the product. From the user perspective, most of that will not be obvious. What will be obvious is a lack of out-of-memory exceptions and hopefully a quicker editor experience in larger solutions as less time is spent in memory swap operations. There are some downsides to this new version landing, however. We are expecting some impact to our product schedule, but we're taking measures to minimize that. Supporting a new release of Visual Studio has a significant development and testing overhead that will unfortunately mean that we will have to drop support for Visual Studio 2017 in order to pick up the new version. According to our installer metrics, that should not actually have that wide of an impact on most of you. Going back to one of the earliest slides in this deck, keep your developer tools up to date. That means SDI and Visual Studio. Finally, I expect that there will be a public preview for Visual Studio 2022 soon. There's no telling whether or not SDI will be ready for that preview in any kind of capacity for you to use it. But please do pay attention to the Synergex blog. If we do have a release that supports it, we will announce it there. That is the final detail that I have for the Visual Studio integration product update. We got to talk about what was new in Visual Studio 2019, what was new in the SDI product, what's upcoming in the SDI product, and got to finish off with what's upcoming in Visual Studio. I'm really excited to see that new Visual Studio 2022 editor. And with that said, who has the first question?
Awesome. So let's get started with the first question coming from Gordon, Ireland. Can you target a runtime for all projects in a solution, or do you have to set this project by project?
That's a great question, Gordon. So the UI only supports setting it project by project, but if you're utilizing our common props functionality, that runtime setting is just one property on the MS Build side. So if you're comfortable opening up that common props file, you could set it as a property there and get all of the rest of the projects to pick it up.
Great. Thanks for that answer, Marty. Our next question comes from Stuart Cranston, and he says, can runtime targeting of traditional Synergy complete with prototyping be done outside of Visual Studio?
Okay. So I'm taking that question two ways. I'll just answer it both ways. You can absolutely run all of the tools yourself and get the runtime targeting behavior. I believe the actual property on the actual argument on the tools is QRT compat. You can find documentation about that on the building and compiling Synergy programs in the docs, I believe. And that's important because you have to get the version numbers right. You'll need to go there to reference what version codes to use. The other way I'm taking that question is if you have Visual Studio projects, you can also do this outside of Visual Studio building with MS Build. You should be able to do MS Build of your solution to still get all the benefits of the runtime targeting.
Great. Thanks, Marty. So another question from Stuart. Can you mark class methods as internal in traditional Synergy and then have them exposed to unit tests?
Internal. I'm not certain. In fact, I would hazard to say that we probably don't support the internal accessibility modifier in traditional Synergy. From a loading perspective, we don't have any problem. I guess we do. We would need the methods to be public in order to be called by the test framework now. This is something that I should do a little bit more looking into and see if internal is something that we can support.
Great. Thanks for that question, Stuart, and thanks for the answer, Marty. All right. Our next question is from Dion Campbell. And the question is, will all the Synergy Windows scripting tools be available via Synergy.net projects?
So the script or the Windows scripts are for toolkit applications for the most part. So I don't think that they are supported by Synergy.net at all. I think it's going to be exclusively a traditional Synergy feature.
Awesome.
Someone could prove me wrong here, but based on my limited knowledge of Windows scripts, I think that's true.
Yeah. Okay. And then a couple questions in the private chat. Oh, a follow-up from Dion, sorry. More specifically, will scr_process be available via a Synergy.net API?
I don't, if it's currently available, I don't think it would be changed at all. If it's not currently available, I don't think there are any plans to add additional low-level Windows and toolkit functionality to Synergy.net right now. That is a conversation that I'd like to hear more about, though. If you've got a really good use case, we'd love to chat about it.
Awesome. And then if you have questions or want more information on runtime version targeting, Steve Ives has posted a link to more information on the chat screen as well, just for the audience. And another question from Mary Smith. Mary says, how have other users moving from Slick to VS found it? What were their greatest obstacles?
That's a good question. So we've had a number of users make the transition. I think in the early days, the hardest part that most users have is getting their code ready for strong prototyping. We do provide some options in order to minimize that impact, like some relax options that let you get away with a few of the more common patterns that aren't actually too negative for your program. But the strong prototyping is really there to help you catch potential future problems at compile time. So I think that is the biggest challenge for most users. There is a learning curve if you're not already a Visual Studio user, getting used to how some of the tools work and getting used to some hotkey differences. But you can always customize that experience to have a lower impact. Maybe some other users here could chime in if they've had experiences moving from Slickedit.
Absolutely. Wonderful. One private question that I got, it says, I have recently started doing .NET Core and noticed there is no unit test project type for .NET Core. Are you planning to add .NET Core test projects? If so, do you have a timeline for that?
We are planning on adding the .NET Core unit test projects. The hope is that we will have it ready for like a November release timeframe. It is on our schedule. We would have liked to have had it ready already, but it didn't get prioritized along other things.
Life happens, huh?
Yep.
Okay, and then wrapping up here, you mentioned a couple times reaching out during the presentation. It sounds like you guys are looking for some feedback. What's the best way for the audience to do that?
That's a great question. We try to engage on all of the channels. So if you're on the ideas site, we're active there looking at your feedback. You can always reach out through support. The support team is great and they are happy to put you in contact with us. If you have something that's really important for you and your business, of course, you can reach out through your account representative or your account manager. And they will happily put you in touch with us as well. And I think my email address is probably somewhere around here. If you have something SDI specific that you would love to see and you don't want to remember any of those others, you can reach out to me and I'll make sure it also gets to the appropriate people.